additional announcement for the list of things going on. We also have an Anishinaabe first language speaker in residence. She prefers to be called the Anishinaabe Oma. And she is at our offices Monday and Wednesday from noon to 4, and on Friday in the morning from 10 to 12. We hope you'll stop by. We do have a nice room with a fridge and a coffee maker and all the amenities. So, as you probably heard in that introduction, my research is more centered in historical contexts. So this talking more about policy and implementation is a little outside my usual comfort zone, but I will do my best to be my usual animated self. In this talk, I was asked to frame the successes that we achieved in the Summer Institute. And to me, that was nowhere demonstrated as strongly as in the space of understanding how much more faculty can provide to their students when we go beyond simple cultural diversity training to a space of literacy and indigeneity. And I actually took that terminology from one of the faculty members who had enrolled in the Summer Institute. When we were about 3/4 of the way through the programming in June, of course, the report from the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Commission dropped with its 231 recommendations. And so, of course, we made space during our session to discuss that. And the faculty member in question said, without this institute, I would not have had the literacy in indigeneity to understand the scope and context of the recommendations from the report. So this is what we're talking about in terms of moving beyond, because as we go from a space where we have made room, right, by embracing an ideal of cultural competency and Indigenous inclusion, to a space where we want to have genuine and meaningful Indigenous content infusion across the faculty. We have to provide to that faculty the training that they have not received in our educational institutions to this time. For those faculty to not just present material from a packaged curriculum, but to be able to meaningfully delve into the critical issues and answer student questions as they arise. Faculty need a stronger preparation. And I think one of the places we're really seeing that is in the hesitance, the fear. Faculty were very confident and comfortable in our institute to say, you know, I really want to do this infusion, but I don't want to do it wrong, I'm afraid. So that's kind of our little introduction, and I'm going to start with talking about what is cultural competency. It's essentially, as defined, if you look up cultural competency right now, you will be sent to about 10 to 15 to I don't know how many corporate producers of cultural competency training. And most of their definitions shake down to the ability to understand, communicate with, and effectively interact with people across cultures through an awareness of worldview and respect. So in this approach, culture is the focus because culture serves as a roadmap for both perceiving and interacting with the world. And it's a concept that first emerged in Indigenous education and healthcare in the 1970s. At a systemic level, competence is defined as the ability of providers and organizations to effectively deliver services that meet social, cultural, and linguistic needs of clients, students, and patients. All right, that wasn't the right button. Oh. Okay. So we see this also reflected in some of the major reports. The Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples had a number of principles, one of which is respect, which calls on all Canadians to create a climate of positive mutual regard between and among peoples. So again, a reflection, another iteration of this cultural competency, with Indigenous cultures becoming, quote, a part of Canada's national character. Now, all of this is really good stuff, right? In education, studies have shown that cultural programming reinforces the cultural identity of Indigenous students, which improves retention and completion rates for Indigenous learners, and that participating in culture and ceremony helps Indigenous individuals to remain strong in the face of ongoing racism and colonialism. See if it works this time. No. This clicker is not working for me.
Okay.
Unless I'm just hitting the wrong sort of thing here.
Yeah.
Am I supposed to be hitting the circle instead of this top button? Yeah, something wrong thing. Sorry. All right. So related to cultural competency is Indigenous inclusion. Greater representation of Indigenous people in the workforce, with cultural competency identified as a needed condition to make Indigenous inclusion in the workforce or among the population it serves successful. So Gowdery and Lorenz identified this approach as one of inclusion and access without commitment to rethink the curricular and structural design of the academy. So, and when we look at what these projects have done, they certainly have done a lot. Since 1970, Indigenous people have increased their presence in higher education as both students and academics. We have over 2,000 Indigenous students and more than 35 Indigenous faculty at our university, and that is no small accomplishment. However, there is a certain level on which these strategies have plateaued in terms of their success. At an institution that serves nearly 30,000 students, we are nowhere near the enrollments or a workforce that reflects the demographics of the province of Manitoba, where nearly 20% of citizens are Indigenous. Despite some changes to the education system, Indigenous students and professors still confront significant challenges and barriers in post-secondary education due to imagined, narrated, and regulated images of Indigenous identity, with the result that they live with systemic racism on a daily basis. In looking at what this means and where we're at, creating a cultural competency can often sort of reduce the amount of investment that workers put into learning about our communities. It creates a fairly static component or a static idea of who our communities are, which, though written big, is one of the basic stereotypes, right? That we are frozen in time, that we don't have a depth of historical context and sophistication. So what we're lacking here in terms of trying to combat racism, when we look at where racism is occurring in our campus, and we hear that in talking to our students, it is a systemic racism in that most who are perhaps putting forward ideas that students perceive as part of a racial hierarchy are not intentional, right? People present statistics without contextualizing them historically. They don't intend to present a stereotype, but by not giving the context, they can, in fact, reinforce stereotypes among their students that those students then use against one another. Right? So, when we think about the hard work that is going to be to move towards a general literacy in indigeneity among our faculty. We have to remember that we ourselves have the power to change the systemic barriers that our students feel and build a reconciled Canada. The partnership starts here at every level of our institution as we look to serve students who will graduate into Manitoba, where 1 in 5 customers, clients, patients, co-workers, and employers and employees will be Indigenous. So doing this work not only helps the Indigenous population and the goal of reconciliation, doing this work helps everyone in Manitoba to succeed in their career. So these are various scholarly criticisms of cultural competency. Dr. LaRocque already in 1975 said awareness of cultural difference is not equivalent to understanding systemic racism and does not equip one to intervene in and address racialized discourse and contexts. St. Denis, or St. Denis, I'm not sure which way it's pronounced, in some organizations, cultural competency came to replace actual workforce diversification. In other words, if we just teach people about these cultural differences, we don't have to actually hire anyone of cultural difference. Razek in 1998 says that we should be concerned about this rhetoric of cultural competency because it redirects efforts to reform the system and address ongoing settler maintenance of colonial boundaries through the addition of side services most in the organization will not encounter. And so this is the kind of thing that being a history teacher, where we usually have these great textbooks with a primary text and then a box on the side that we always refer to as the sidebar, right? It means that at many campuses, cultural competency and cultural programming has been established in a way that most students will never encounter, right? And this means that it's a sidebar, it's a side piece, but it's not addressing the central problem. And there is a level on which we can build up the amount of support services for Indigenous students 10 times higher than it is now. But if we haven't addressed the sources of racism and tried to unpack them and eliminate them on our campus, then we will still have students saying, I'm uncomfortable here. So, Code Meeks, cultural competency can lead to a context in which Indigenous people, whether serving or served by the organization, are racially constructed by that assumption of what culture is. And the Indigenous community is incredibly diverse. Of course, we have First Nations, Inuit, Métis, but above and beyond that, we have people who are traditional, people who are Christian, people who are atheist. We have folks with all kinds of different perspectives, even from the same community. And so this can also be an issue when someone goes to a 2-hour cultural diversity training, comes out saying, this is who Indigenous people are across the board, and we lose that individuality. Okay. Indigenous students, staff, and faculty are expected to adapt to the intellectual worldview, teaching, and research styles of the academy while allowed to display their culture. In other words, the assimilative project of education, which has been under criticism for a very long time from Indigenous communities, is not necessarily tackled by the process of cultural competency. So how do we emerge from the sidebar? We need to emerge from the sidebar certainly to become part of the central narrative and identity of Canada. Indigenous histories and colonialism have to be taught as a central part of that narrative, and we're seeing reforms in our K-12 system that reflect that. And of course, we have the related directive to infuse content here. But again, asking our faculty who don't have that background to be the purveyors of that content leads us into another trap. And these are being histories that are not even regularly taught at the graduate level until relatively recently, and even then, not at all post-secondary institutions. This is a knowledge that needs to become common in a very short period of time. And our faculty is going to need significant training and support in order to move forward into that. The Western canon as a whole needs to be re-examined for colonial bias. In the primary training that I do across campus, I pull the discussion of colonialism back to 300 AD. And that's simply because I'm limited by time. I could go further. The underlying assumptions that justify what happens following 1492 is already baked into the loaf in that moment, right? We have to look at texts like St. Augustine's The City of God, at the ideologies around the Crusades, in order to understand the extent to which non-Christian nations were determined to be illegitimate and have no political authority that European Christian kings were required to observe. We take for granted in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but we don't think about the fact that if today one of us flew to Hawaii and went, beaches, perfect temperatures, beautiful plants, I want it, it's mine, right? Would that be legal? Absolutely not. And we can look at the international community today and see the extent to which Russia is still being punished for the annexation of Crimea. Even a few decades ago, the way the UN came together to throw Iraq out of Kuwait. So we are not questioning fundamentally in our educational system an event that we would fundamentally launch major political contexts against today. And so we have to unpack that. We have to look at if I am a professor in political science and I'm teaching the main texts, that when I talk about these social contract theorists who describe the state of nature in which every man is for himself and there are no states, as in the beginning all the world was America. If I assign that to my students and I don't contextualize it in the actual history, it reinforces the fundamental stereotypes that pervade our society today. This is the kind of systemic curricular reevaluation that universities need to embark on to become places that promote literacy and indigeneity and that promote reconciliation. Gabry and Lorenz, in a recent article in 2018, have identified an indigenization continuum at Canada's campuses. They did a survey of 25 Indigenous academics and allies and determined that university responses to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission fall along a continuum from Indigenous inclusion to reconciliation indigenization to decolonial indigenization. Reconciliation indigenization locates indigenization on common ground between Canadian and Indigenous ideals, creating a new, broader consensus on debates such as what counts as knowledge, how should Indigenous knowledge and European-derived knowledge be reconciled, and what types of relationships academic institutions should have with Indigenous communities. This is accomplished through scholarship, teaching, and academic policymaking. Decolonial indigenization envisions the wholesale overhaul of the governance structure of the academy to balance power relations between Indigenous people and their knowledge and Canadians to create a new kind of educational institution. So we certainly have moved beyond Indigenous inclusion, although we still have work to do there, and have started embarking on reconciliation indigenization. Whether decolonial indigenization is a real expectation, there certainly are scholars who promote it, but I think when we're talking about publicly funded institutions, we probably ultimately are going to be most successful at this middle point. Reconciliation indigenization includes removing procedural barriers to Indigenous student success. To achieve this, staff need to develop literacy in indigeneity. Reconciliation indigenization focuses on systemic curricular change. And as I've said, to develop this, we need literacy in indigeneity as a precursor to infusing Indigenous content across the curriculum. Indigenous students describe profound experiences of racism in mixed classrooms where colonial history and its impact on Indigenous peoples is presented. And this is coming from Colonized Classrooms by Cote Meeks. At the same time, those same students would absolutely demand their right to be in those classes. They don't want them taken out of the curriculum because they see the importance and because the context, the content in the course is so meaningful to them. The problem is that other students in the class may react with what scholars have called microaggressions, eye-rolling, talking, making comments inaudible to the instructor. These kinds of resistances are something that, as we add this content to our classes, faculty need to learn how to manage. Many of the faculty we're asking to infuse this content have never dealt with race issues in the classroom before. So giving them the training and competency to adequately recognize these microaggressions and maintain a safe classroom space is really important. So, in thinking about this, besides the fact that nobody wants to do one more 2-hour training, it seems to me that literacy in indigeneity really cannot be achieved through a 2-hour training session. And these kinds of training sessions also in many cases lack accountability. You attend, you might be looking at your calendar or your email the whole time on your phone, and then you get to write down that you completed it. How much did you really absorb, right? So the ability to achieve this literacy through online programs is another thing that universities have pursued. Some of the more famous and popular ones include the one out of UBC and the one out of University of Alberta. I think that the literacy through these online programs is also limited because one of the most profound and important things to understand about our Indigenous communities is relationships. And it's very difficult to begin building relationships through training with an electronic device. There certainly is a role for it. I think the libraries have done an excellent job of combining a training program with using the University of Alberta online program, but combining it with weekly on-campus discussions with Indigenous faculty, so that you still have that community and that discussion of community, and that going through some of the difficult issues that are brought up in these tutorials with the community. The full burden of indigenizing campus should not fall on the shoulders of its Indigenous faculty and staff. This is something that we hear Indigenous faculty and staff say often because there is so much work to be done. But that said, we do need Indigenous people in key positions to support the goal of curricular Indigenous content infusion. If we don't have folks that have had that training involved in training, then what do we have, right? Does someone who has not fully studied stereotypes, impacts of colonialism, Indigenous history, how can they actually perform the job of training someone who's going to have to address those issues in their classroom? So our Indigenous faculty, our Native Studies faculty, individuals who have had this training will need in key positions to support this training. All instruction around this on our campus should be based in faculty expertise. The difficulty of all of this is that in many ways when we talk about reconciling history, whether that's reconciling history here on our campus or in the K-12 system, we're talking about asking Canadians to make a worldview shift. Okay? And basically, nations construct histories as origin stories, right? In the United States, where I taught for many years, we've had several rounds of attempts to create national standards in education. We call them the Common Core. And this is what we all agree must be taught as a part of a U.S. history class. These have been enormously politically contested. The first attempt to do them was in the 90s, and it failed entirely. The second attempt to do them was under the Obama administration. The first iteration of that Common Core was revoked and replaced with a more conservative one the following year. This is because what folks will come back and say is, I want my child to be proud of their country. I want them to grow up to be a good citizen. I don't want them to hear bad and negative things in school. So we end up with what I actually refer to as origin myths, right? In the United States, our origin myth is that we are a nation of liberty who were founded in a revolution against taxation without representation. But that's because we teach it completely devoid of the context of the 7 Years' War and the settlement outcomes with Indigenous people and Francophone people resulting from that conflict. If you really pick apart the Declaration of Independence, you will see that at least a quarter to a third of the items refer to these settlements and the degree to which they keep American settlers from profiting off Western lands. Okay? So what does this mean? Well, in American politics, right, we have the development of the Tea Party. We have a consistent narrative that all taxation is bad. All of this comes from the way that we teach about our origin story and who we are. So when we talk about changing historical narratives, the reason there's so much resistance and so much deflection is because we're changing identity. And in doing that, we often see students go through the stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, right, before coming to a place of acceptance. So it's a difficult process. It's one that often causes students who have not completed that transition to acceptance to lash out on course evaluation forms. Knowing how to contextualize these reactions, knowing how to frame this material to prevent some of the worst of those reactions is very important and is a skill our faculty needs to learn. So, literacy and indigeneity, these are the components that I would say are part of it. Culture and protocol, what we would have said was the cultural competency piece. Positionality and relationships, history, political status and rights. one of the mistaken assumptions that I have heard on this campus and on many others is the assumption that Indigenous people are another ethnic group, and that overlooks the political relationship between Indigenous people and Canadians established through the Indian Act and established through treaties. Further, established through various court cases like the Powley decision. Okay? So we have to understand that this is different. Because when we talk about allowing ourselves to be categorized with other ethnic groups on campus, those groups are often fighting to achieve a form of inclusion, which Indigenous people reject as a form of assimilation and culture loss. Okay. We also need to train our faculty in recognizing systemic racism and institutional barriers to Indigenous student success, and how to recognize and deflate privilege, fragility, and racism in the classroom. So all of this hopefully will frame for you why the faculty feel a lot of fear around this project, right? They're afraid to do it wrong because they know racism is wrong. They don't want to come off approaching this incorrectly. They're afraid of causing more trauma to students that have already experienced trauma. So we need to create this cultural literacy, and we also need to destigmatize discussions of racism. Right? In many ways, discussions of race have become incredibly polarizing because we have made racism itself, and somewhat rightly so, such an incredible negative in modern society. But what that means is when racism is embedded in a systemic bureaucracy to the point that it has become routine and invisible, it makes it incredibly difficult to raise and discuss that issue. Because people are so afraid that by raising the fact that they work at a system that has some policies put in place in the 50s or the 60s under very different social norms, that they suddenly will fall under this criteria of racist. That is not the case. For most people, the barriers are invisible. And it's about creating a space in which we can have a conversation that makes those barriers visible and that leads to concrete unpacking of those barriers. D'Angelo has picked up this sort of methodology from women's studies. And it's basically saying that unconscious racism within an organization is like a bird cage. Each wire reinforces the others and strengthens the cage. But privilege obscures the bars, so that those who are in that system from a place of privilege are so close to the cage that they're looking between the bars and don't see them. Okay? Seeing an unobstructed view of the bird, they wonder why it doesn't fly free. Okay? So we're trying to create a context within which we can step back, recognize the bars for what they are, and begin to identify the bars nearest us that we have the power to take down. And this often gets into discussions of intention versus impact, right? I need to talk to you about X because it's having a racist outcome. Oh, but I totally didn't intend that. That wasn't the topic of discussion, right? Your intention is beside the point. And so I have this wonderful cartoon here. The dragon says, if I tell you it's a sign of affection, it's a sign of affection. I can't help it if you're flammable, right? So this is what we've come to call fragility, this concern about emphasizing the intention rather than addressing the impact. And addressing the impact is really the place where we need to all be as Canadians. So what did we do in the Summer Institute? We designed it as a graduate seminar format. And, you know, as myself and Associate Dean Heidi Marks and Arts were putting forward some of the arguments for this, folks were saying, oh, I don't think faculty will want to commit that kind of time. I don't think faculty will want to do a graduate reading load. And it's true, not everybody did the reading, but most did. And not everybody came to every session, but we had a core group out of the 30 faculty, about 20, were incredibly regular attendance. We met once a week for 3 hours of lecture, followed by lunch and discussion. This gives students both the time to prepare the readings and time to really absorb and think about and process what can be some very difficult content. There are other models out there that look at sort of condensing all of this into a 1 to 2 week process, and my sense of those is that they are completely overwhelming. It's too much information too fast for people to process and think how to address and incorporate. We also met at Microaggressions in the circle room. I wanted to disrupt the expectations of the standard classroom. Even in here, we have me up at this podium speaking to a microphone and all of you guys in your chairs in our nice square room. The circle room had us all equally seated at a round table where we could speak with one another from a position of equals. Food helped socialize and build relationships. I'm telling you, Indigenous people have known that for millennia. All of our gatherings involve food. And in fact, traditionally, if you had invited a council to come and hear your issues, you would provide food for all the people you invited. So in that sense, I felt it was very important to immediately give back, because these faculty that chose to participate gave up a significant amount of time during their summer to participate in this institute. And even though they did not have to pay to attend, the commitment of that time is significant. These are parents with young children who are managing to get them to all of the summer activities and still read the book and still come to the session. So to me, constantly thinking about how I can respectfully thank them for that commitment was important. So food is a part of that. It also allowed, following our lecture sessions and our discussions, a more informal space for conversation. And you would see maybe the 3 folks who were all in the same department kind of huddle up and talk about how today's topic could be used in their discipline, right? So you had a lot of these smaller informal discussions that really helped with this process. Following that, we held talking circle in the afternoon for folks that really wanted a more formal space in which to process feelings from what they had learned that day. We actually didn't need very many of those. Most folks had their lunch and went on to their day. But I still think it was important for the sessions where it was needed and for the folks who needed it. We also did response papers. And response papers, just a response to the reading, a response to the discussion. I had some faculty that were writing me on average 10 pages a week. To me, this was an opportunity for them to ask questions they were afraid of asking in front of a group because, again, of the stigma around, what if I sound racist? So these response papers created that safe context in which we could have that conversation without any of these labels being applied. They also allowed further exploration into very specific topics. How should I work this in my discipline? I teach in architecture. What are some places that you would see it intersecting here? So we were able to have some of those conversations through the response papers as well. So the weeks, we had 3 weeks on culture, one of which was a full day in community. I've listed all the various instructors here to give them credit for their work. I did really a small portion of the instruction myself. Then we did 2 weeks on Indigenous history and political status, and included shorter presentations in those weeks on Inuit history and Métis history and identity. We had a week on Indigenous stereotypes, a week on incorporating Indigenous literature into the classroom, a week on the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women report, a week on privilege and fragility and how to deal with them in the classroom, and a week on barriers to Indigenous student success in post-secondary education. And in addition to leading that discussion, we also ended with a panel of 3 students. And because this was a program in the Faculty of Arts, I specifically invited students that were now in graduate or post-secondary programs on campus, but who had started out in arts. And I wanted to do that because I wanted them to be able to speak about their experiences in the faculty, but without concern that the faculty were going to respond through their grades. So we had students from education, for example, on that panel, and many of the faculty said it was one of the most moving experiences of the whole seminar. So some statistics. 30 faculty enrolled, 20 attended regularly, average attendance was about 22. The circle room comfortably holds 25. And make sure I stay on time because I do have to be at this.
About 15 minutes left.
15 minutes? Yeah. All right. So 11 people submitted response papers, 8 did so regularly. 22 completed a survey evaluation of the program. Of those respondents, all who attended the session on barriers felt that their understanding of barriers to Indigenous student success had improved. All those who had attended the historical sessions felt their knowledge of Indigenous Canadian history had improved, and so forth. It was an incredibly positive feedback that we got, and in particular emphasizing skill increases in all of these different areas, and finally, that all of them would recommend this institute to their colleagues. 14 indicated that participating in the institute had led to revisions in their syllabi to include Indigenous content. I wanted to note that some participants were administrators or staff, otherwise that number might have been higher. No faculty indicated that taking the institute would lead directly to submitting a syllabus for consideration as an Indigenous content course in arts, where we have set a requirement for those courses that they be 80% Indigenous content. But I'm going to go through some examples of where faculty have decided to include content as a result of the institute. As noted, we had individuals from engineering, law, architecture, and social work join us in addition to faculty from many departments in arts. So one faculty indicated that in their transportation planning course, they will now revise it to include a history of Indigenous trade routes and travel. A course in the Department of Classics will use ideas from the Institute to interpret and present material and draw comparisons to current colonialism or context in Canadian history. A sociology professor stated, as a result of participating, I realized the way I've been teaching some subject areas, though I've always included Indigenous content, could be better designed to incorporate Indigenous knowledge throughout the material. Another sociology professor stated, I've been developing an intro to sociology course in distance and online education. Now for every unit, I've made sure there's an adequate content on Indigenous issues. A fine arts professor indicated she intended to revise many of her courses for some time to include Indigenous content, and that the Institute was the prompt she had needed to take up that work. An architecture professor, 2 courses in design studio and history and theory of landscape and urbanism In the first, the students are doing a design proposal for Cap Young Barracks. There's no way to do that project without Indigenous content. I probably would not have used the site if not for this course. I'm at least able to set up discussions on Treaty 1, colonization, contemporary Indigenous issues and culture, land-based education, traditional knowledge, and then invite other speakers to help develop this. There was no Indigenous component in history and theory, which they were concerned about, their little exclamation point. So I can add that, drawing on some of the arguments presented in the course and supported by guest speakers. Religious studies, some of the material I've used in my classes has become questionable, not as rooted in community cooperative forms of investigation. I would be looking for new material focusing on critical and relational models. So, final thoughts. I really want to point out this bottom one. This was in the anything else to add portion of the evaluations. Yes, as knowledgeable as I have become on Indigenous issues and history, this course has done more. Without trying to sound foolish, taking this course has transformed who I am as a person, as an educator, as a researcher, as a member of the university community, as a parent, a friend, and a person. This is what reconciliation looks like. And I hope that we will find other opportunities similar to this to continue creating a literacy in indigeneity across our campus. Thank you.
Okay, so I know Dr. Miller needs to get to Senate for 1:30, but maybe we have about 5 minutes she could answer questions if anyone has anything they'd like to ask.
Yes, you are the only one.
Has there been or will there be that training on recognizing and addressing racial violence in classrooms for staff and faculty?
Yes, I mean, that was sort of a part of what this
Yeah.
was. I didn't really go into the specific readings and pedagogies for each class day, but those are involved in there. I would like to see them move forward. I've also been working on a training with Val Williams called Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion 2.0 that has some of that work in it. So you can look for that. But yeah, I think more of that work needs to be done on our campus, absolutely. Yeah?
Is this published somewhere, this information?
No, I wrote it last night. But I do intend to publish it, and you know, anything that I've cited in there, I can certainly share the citations. Yeah.
I may have missed this when I was closing the door, but are you offering the Summer Institute again?
Our dean's office has been presented with the collated information from the evaluations this week. So we have not had it confirmed or denied, but I think that given how positive the reviews are, it's very likely, unless financial situation of the campus significantly changes for some unforeseen reason.
Any chance you could share the reading list from the Institute?
Absolutely, send me an email.
Okay.
I'm just wondering if there's any thought about putting a seminar like this together for K-12 educators.
I would love to see that happen. Being that I'm relatively new to Manitoba and that I'm not in the Faculty of Education, I haven't had the networks to organize such a thing, but if somebody wanted to work with me on that, I would be very open to it. Yes?
Hello.
Hello?
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment and an acknowledgement of this presentation. We met this spring. My name is Alfred Anderson.
Yes.
I came by to the university. I wasn't in school then. And I had read this book on the First Nation history of Canada. I went to the department looking for some sort of support or some sort of awareness that the university or institutions are working toward benefiting these issues. So you gave me your book that describes a little bit about the agency that there is in Native studies. So this is yet another example of that agency, which I'm very thankful for. It gives me a good outlook on the institution that I'm attending, and I would like to acknowledge that this presentation has provided that.
Very much.
Thank you.
So with that, I really do have to run to Senate.
Okay. And I just want to let everyone know before you leave, our next Indigenous Scholars Speaker Series talk is Dr. Negan Sinclair. It will